contract for the project is properly handled and properly delivered throughout the project. And then finally, contract closing, dealing with the issues related to closing the contract, producing final payments, returning any goods, any proprietary material, and ensuring both the buyer and the seller are satisfied with the procurement process and that the contract has received what it needs to be successful. Project procurement management can often be thought of as a very simple process, simply going out and buying something that the project needs. And that is true. A well-managed procurement process makes it look simple. But managing a procurement process well requires a lot of work, involves reviewing and understanding the impact on each procurement decision as based on each of the 6 steps as defined in the PMBOK guide. One of the biggest issues with procurement management is the fact that it produces a contract. A contract is a legal binding document. A contract obligates the seller to certain obligations and obligates the buyer to pay for, receive, and approve the products, the services produced by the seller. Each party, the buyer and the seller, must ensure they're delivering to the terms and conditions of the contract to ensure that there are no legal issues, there is no legal recourse taken against the project. As soon as a project goes into legal issues, legal recourse, the project itself is going to suffer and the procurement management process is going to break down. The first step in project procurement management is to plan your purchases and acquisitions. In other words, make or buy. You need to decide if there are products or services that your project requires that can be made by the project team or must be bought or are better economically serving to the project if you buy them. So you're looking for goods, you're looking for services that are required by the project that will be delivered outside the team. So that effectively is what the make or buy decision is all about. Understanding what goods, what services are required by the project, but they will be delivered by a third party that's not part of the core project team. If it's a make decision, it's not part of procurement management. It's part of standard project delivery and would be addressed in the work breakdown structure and the other standard project management activities that we've discussed so far. Buying is where procurement management comes in. Once you've made a buy decision, you then need to determine how much do you need to buy. Do you need to buy 1? Do you need to buy 50? Do you need to buy 5 hours? Do you need to buy 10 hours? You need to determine specifically how much of each good and each service you need to buy, and you need to determine when you need to be buying it. Are you going to buy it on the first day of the project, the first month of the project, 6 months into the project? It's important to make your purchase decision and buy your product at the time when the project needs it, so you're not tying up expensive project capital too early, but in the same behalf, by buying too late, you're causing the project delivery challenges because the goods and services required are not available in the time frame that the project team requires it. And then finally, your plan, purchase, and decisions, you need to determine how you're going to purchase. What style of contract are you going to use? Are you going to use a fixed price contract? Are you going to use a time and materials contract? How much control, how much management do you want over the project procurement process? We'll come back and discuss how or the type of contract in just a moment. Once you have determined your project purchase and acquisition process, you will develop your project procurement plan. The project procurement plan is going to identify the results of each make or buy decision, how much is going to be bought, when it's going to be bought, and how it's going to be bought, what type of contract. The project procurement plan will then be passed to the project acceptor or the project sponsor for agreement, for approval that the funds required for the purchase process is available to the project and that the project is best served by buying these goods and services as opposed to making them internal to the project. The key component for procurement planning is to determine the appropriate contract type. Contract types can range from cost reimbursement through to time and materials to fixed price to purchase order. What do each of these contract types mean? Cost reimbursement consists of an agreement between the buyer and the seller where for every unit purchased, the buyer agrees to pay for all of the costs the seller incurs to provide that unit, plus an agreed upon percentage markup to cover profitability from the seller's viewpoint. Time and materials is much the same, with the difference being the agreement is simply the buyer agrees to buy units at a given price. The buyer is often not aware of the markup. The buyer is often not aware of the profitability from the seller's viewpoint. The buyer simply knows they have an agreed upon price for each unit purchased, and the seller is obligated to provide each unit for that price. Fixed price is an agreement between the buyer and the seller is for a final product. There is an agreed upon fixed price for the product, and for that fixed price, the seller commits to delivering the product at the agreed upon scope to the buyer at a fixed price, at a given price. Purchase order is similar, the difference being a purchase order often covers a longer period of time, often covers a broader span than simply a project, where there's an agreement between the buyer's company and the seller's company to purchase units at an agreed upon price for a prolonged period of time that often extends longer than the actual project timeline itself. So how do you as a project manager decide whether cost reimbursement, time and materials, fixed price, or purchase order is the appropriate style of contract for your project? It all really boils down to two things. One is the level of control that you wish to have in terms of the project's activity in the procurement process, and the second is the degree of risk you're willing to assume that you're willing to address on behalf of the project. So if we look at a cost reimbursement process, the level of control is very high from the project's viewpoint. With cost reimbursement, you, the project manager, have total control over how many units you buy. You have total control over what the units look like. You have total control over when the units are purchased. Because it's a cost reimbursement, if the seller has to add more product, add more time to each unit produced to satisfy your quality expectations, to satisfy your specific deliverable requirements, they are going to receive full cost reimbursement plus their profitability for that unit. So therefore, they're willing to give you total control over the process because they are able to work within your confines. If you take that to the far end, your level of control over a purchase order is extremely low. It's a predefined, pre-existing purchase order between your company and the seller's company where each unit is of a defined quality, a defined specification, a defined functionality. So therefore, from a project's viewpoint, you have very little to no control over each unit, and you must adhere to, abide by, the terms and conditions specified in the purchase order. So if we look at it from the other viewpoint, from a risk viewpoint, cost reimbursement, the project risk is very low. From a cost reimbursement viewpoint, as we discussed, you have total control over the process. You can work with the supplier, you can work with your seller to make sure that the quality is what you want. You can work with the seller to make sure the functionality is what you want. So therefore, the project's risk is very low because you have the control over the process to ensure the final deliverable is exactly what you want. But from a purchase order viewpoint, your risk level is very high because you don't have the level of control, because you must accept the terms, the conditions, the quality, the functionality as defined in the purchase order. Therefore, the risk to the project is extremely high that the end product, the purchased product, will not satisfy your project requirements. And if you look at the time and materials and the fixed price, it really is basically a continuous connection between the level of control your project gets and the level of risk as you go through the various types of contracts. So therefore, it's important as part of your purchasing process to determine what level of control you require over the process, what level of risk you're willing to accept as part of the procurement process, and then pick where in the spectrum your purchasing requirements will be best satisfied. In this discussion, we focused on the 4 very basic types of contracts: cost reimbursement, time and materials, fixed price, and purchase orders. In reality, there's an unlimited number of contracts, and the type and style of contract is probably limited only by the imagination of the buyer and the seller to determine some combination, some situation that best is described as cost reimbursement or time and materials or fixed price to satisfy specific project requirements and address the budget, the schedule, the financial issues. For example, cost reimbursement projects can be broken down as cost plus fixed fee, where it's the cost plus a predefined fixed fee, or it can be cost plus percentage of cost, or it can be cost plus incentive, or time and materials can be broken down to time and materials to max, or time and materials to a predefined limit, and then cost plus, or fixed price can be fixed price for the first 5 units, and then a time and materials for each unit beyond that, and on and on and on. It's very important that you as a project manager are aware of the type of contract that's being negotiated for your project, and that you don't get caught up in, if I can use the term, the smoke and mirrors as part of the sales process, where you have a vendor salesperson trying to invent a new style of contract that's going to most likely benefit the seller's company more so than your company. So it's very important that you understand the type of contract, the degree of control you're going to have over the process, and the degree of risk that you're accepting on behalf of your project based on the style of contract, and that it is appropriate for your contract, and that you're positioning yourself somewhere on this continuum of high-low control and risk levels that satisfies your specific project requirements. The next step in the procurement process is plan the contracting process. In other words, prepare the RFP, the RFI, the RFQ that's required to go out and solicit information from the vendors. If you're not familiar with these terms, RFP stands for Request for Proposal, RFI stands for Request for Information, RFQ stands for Request for Quotation, and basically this alphabet soup will be as wide and as varied as the number of organizations involved in the procurement process. Don't get hung up on whether you're producing an RFP, an RFI, an RFQ. Ensure that you're preparing the document that defines the process to be followed for the procurement process, and most importantly, that you're defining the scope of the procurement. Defining the scope of what you want to purchase is as important as defining the scope for your overall project. Just when you thought you were done with detailed scope definition, you need to go through detailed scope definition again in the procurement process for each and every component that you're going to be procuring, for each and every piece of the project that you're going to be buying. You need to ensure that the scope for your purchases are as well defined, that there's no ambiguity, that there's no room for interpretation when you're buying pieces for your project as when you're developing the overall project plan. It could be argued by some that the scope definition for the procurement processes needs to be more intense, more well-defined than the actual scope itself, and that's simply because you're entering into binding legal contracts as part of the procurement process, and therefore it's important that the scope definition is so well-defined, so ironclad, that there's no room for ambiguity, there's no room for interpretation in the contracting process, that it absolutely binds the seller to deliver exactly what you need for successful project delivery. So again, don't get hung up on whether it's an RFP or an RFI or an RFQ. What you need to focus on is that you're defining the scope for the procurement process, that you're defining exactly what it is you want to purchase in sufficient detail that it's going to be clear for the sellers that they can respond to your request and deliver a proposal that says, here is how our company will work within your project to satisfy your overall project goals. A key component to plan contracting is developing the evaluation criteria. You need to have a clear, defensible process that you're going to follow when you're going to evaluate the responses that you receive back from your vendors. I'll show you an example of an evaluation criteria that I have developed. This is a proposal evaluation sheet that I prepared for a proposal that I evaluated recently. This proposal evaluation sheet is designed to be completed by each evaluator and for each company that has responded to the procurement process. So the company's name would be entered here, and the person evaluating the response would be entered here. In preparing the evaluation sheet, which I've already done, you need to go through and understand the important criteria that's being used to evaluate each response. So one of the criteria we had was references, and we're going to rank each reference on a scale of 1 to 5, where 5 is an exceptional through to 1 below average. And then we're going to rank each one based on experience with package, experience with company, experience with the implementation, post-implementation support, and general impression. We have room here for the evaluator to give their specific rankings on the 1 to 5, as well as we provided weights that will be used in the evaluation process itself. So we believe the first 3 are more important than the last 2, so we've ranked each of these as a 2 versus the last 2 would be 1. So simply, if the person evaluated the proposal and felt the experience with the company was a 3, they would enter a 3 there, and we're doing the simple multiplication across to give us the score for each criteria. If we move down in our evaluation form, and here we're ranking it down, we're giving it based on the overall rank that we want references to be in the total project evaluation or proposal evaluation process. Now we're coming down for suitability of proposed product. Again, we have our ranking scale 0 through 5. 5 exceeds expectations, 4 fully meets, 3 meets but will require workarounds or procedural changes, 2 partially meets, 1 is a very incomplete solution, and 0 does not meet at all. And now we've broken it down for general functional requirements. How well does it deal with accident incident reports? This was for an occupational health and safety system, by the way. How well does it deal with claims? How well does it deal with? And again, we put our rankings in. These rankings were based on overall business importance, and the evaluator would continue to evaluate and fill in each of the pieces of information based on the responses received back from the vendor. Interface requirements, same thing. Technical requirements, how well does it support distributed access? How well does it support remote access? And so on, resulting in a final evaluation for the total response for each vendor. And then our matrix is going to sum up and produce a proposal evaluation sheet. So here we're seeing our total score from references has been brought forward, and we're giving references a 10 out of the total evaluation criteria, where these rank up to 100. Suitability of proposed project is going to rank a 40. Customer support and vendor stability gives an overall scale of 10. Industry best practices gives an overall scale of 10, and so on. So this is a very detailed proposal evaluation sheet that I have used that allows you to evaluate each and every component of the proposal, evaluate each and every answer on the proposal against your requirements to ensure that you are truly selecting the best product that satisfies the business requirements, as opposed to maybe picking the proposal that was the most well-written, or the proposal that seems to have all of the answers. But in fact, if you really drill down and look at the detailed evaluation, the point-by-point may not satisfy. It's very important that you develop an evaluation matrix such as this to ensure that your evaluation process is fair, that it truly selects the best response, as opposed to allowing intuition or gut feelings, or I really think this is the best proposal to be evaluated. It truly evaluates you, allows you to evaluate and select point by point which response is going to best satisfy your project requirements. The next step in the procurement process is to request seller responses. In other words, issue the request, issue the RFP. Let qualified vendors know that you need to purchase something on behalf of your project. Who are qualified vendors? How do you identify qualified vendors? Will vary depending on the nature and type of purchase you need to make. Maybe your company has purchased the same type of product or service in the past and has a pre-qualified list of vendors who provide the product or service. in which case the issuing of the request is simple as contacting that pre-qualified list of vendors and saying, here is my current request, please respond with how you will satisfy this. Perhaps you need to advertise a little broader than that. Perhaps you need to advertise in the local newspaper saying, my project needs to buy X, please respond with your intention to submit, and I would be more than happy to provide the full RFP to you. This was appropriate if you believe there are qualified vendors in your local marketplace and that they will be reading the newspaper and be interested in responding to bids based on newspaper advertisement. Perhaps you need to advertise broader than that. Perhaps you need to advertise in a national newspaper to identify your request to a broader audience. Perhaps your request is very focused, very specific. Perhaps advertising in a trade magazine or enrollment in specific buyer-vendor forums will ensure that your request is issued to or is notified to a well-qualified list of vendors who work in that specific marketplace or in that specific market area. The key is ensuring that you're issuing the request to a well-qualified list of vendors, that you're going to get the best possible set of responses back. But on the same behalf, don't issue the request to such a broad group of vendors that instead of getting a manageable 5 to 10 set of qualified responses back from vendors, you get 250. You have to ensure that you're issuing your request to as broad an audience as you need to get a broad but manageable set of responses, as opposed to issuing the request to an extremely broad audience internationally and getting hundreds to thousands of requests back, which you would then be obligated to review and evaluate. Once you issue the request, you will probably almost instantly be in a clarification process. Although you have attempted to make your purchase request to your RFP as clear, as unambiguous, as well-defined as possible, that you've defined as clear a scope statement as possible, there will almost always be instances where your vendors request clarification. If vendor A requests clarification on point number 15, you should provide the clarification to vendor A, but I would suggest to keep the procurement process as level and as even as possible. You should provide that same clarification to all vendors. A common process is all vendor clarifications will be responded to at the end of a week. So every Friday at 3 p.m. we will issue email, a general notification to all vendors of all clarifications received this week. That ensures all vendors are receiving the same information and are able to submit their bids based on the same set of details. A process often used to ensure that all vendors are working from the same page is the establishment of bidder conferences. At a predefined time, all vendors are encouraged to participate in a bidders conference where all questions and answers will be addressed and all clarifications will be provided at that point in time. The key with requesting seller responses is ensure that your request for proposal goes out to a broad audience to ensure you get a range of qualified responses, but that you manage the audience so that you don't get overwhelmed with too many responses, and that during the proposal process itself, you're providing all of the clarifications required by vendors, but you're providing equal and fair clarification to all vendors to ensure that all responses received are based on the same set of requirements and any clarifications and modifications to those requirements through the actual purchasing process itself. The next step in the procurement process is to select the final seller, or sellers if you have multiple purchase requirements. It comes down to evaluating the responses. You've received multiple responses, 2, 5, hopefully not too large a number of responses back from the qualified vendors. You now need to go through and evaluate and respond to each one of the responses. Key is you need to use multiple evaluators so there's no personal biases coming into the evaluation, and you need to use the evaluation matrix that we looked at earlier, that we developed earlier, to ensure that the evaluation is fair and straightforward. Often you will do 2 separate evaluations. Often the technical evaluation will be done first to ensure that the solution satisfies the technical requirements, that it truly addresses the project requirements first, and then secondly, addressing the financial requirement, that once you have determined which packages, which solutions will satisfy the overall project requirements, You will then pick the best package, the best solution based on the financial situation, i.e. the cost for the proposal. But you don't want to let finances be part of the evaluation criteria before you've determined that the fit happens, because you could end up buying the cheapest package that doesn't satisfy the project requirements. And then the final step is the production of the project contract itself. So the evaluation process, we come back to our proposal evaluation sheet. We're evaluating company ABC, and it's been evaluated by myself, Steve. As we said, we go through and we evaluate each and every component. So I have, for this particular company's response, evaluated their experience with the package as a 3, their experience with the company with a 3, a 4, a 1, and a 2 respectively, and I've gone through and I've completed the complete evaluation based on the response I've received back from the vendor. I've done it for the suitability of the proposed project, all of the functional requirements, the interface requirements, the technical requirements, and so on. All of the information that I've done with my detailed evaluation has been brought forward to the summary sheet. So here I'm seeing for company ABC, evaluated by myself. In terms of references, they got a 6.25 out of 10. In terms of suitability proposed product, they got a 26 out of 40. That's not a very high evaluation. That may be enough in itself to discount this vendor from further evaluation, or you may want to go on and look at other vendors. It may be that this is the best solution, but you'll notice at this point in time, the cost of the proposal I have not evaluated. I need to go through and ensure that I have solid technical solutions first, and then once I have a short list of these proposals that satisfy the technical requirements, I would then go in and complete my financial evaluation and evaluate the components, the proposals, and based on the best financial price for the best technical solution. If we come back to the selecting of the seller process, the final step is the establishment of the contract. So once you have selected the final vendor, you then need to go into contract negotiations. You, the project manager, need to be very aware of the contract negotiations process. I like to think of a contract as 2 parts. Part 1 is the standard legal terms and conditions for the contract. Unless you have your degree in law, which as a project manager you probably don't, I certainly don't, I defer all contract discussions, all contract negotiations in terms of the pure legal aspects of the contract to specific legal authorities in my company or specific legal advice solicited by the company. But the key but is you let the legal people look after the contract terms and conditions, but you, the project manager, need to be intimately involved with the contract process in terms of the statement of work. The statement of work comes back to the vendor's statement of their technical solution and how their technical solution is going to satisfy your request, i.e. the scope defined by you to satisfy your project requirements. The statement of work ideally would be a straight carbon copy of the scope statement going into the procurement process, but often when the vendor does not have full compliance to all of your requests, you will need to modify the scope statement so that the vendor is then bound to deliver based on the modified statement of requirements, based on the modified scope, to ensure that you're dealing with all of the issues that the vendor can satisfy for your project and that you, the project manager, understand how the vendor is going to address that. So the contract has the legal aspect. Defer that to your legal authorities, but your contract absolutely have a statement of work, which is where you, the PM, needs to be intimately involved to ensure that the contract statement of work, the scope for the procurement, is exactly what you need for your project and that you fully understand what the vendors will be supplying to support your project. The ongoing management of the contract during project delivery is contained in contract administration. The key component to contract administration is contract compliance, ensuring that both parties, whether you're the buyer or the seller, are compliant with the terms and conditions of the contract. Many project managers simply focus on maintaining compliance with the statement of work, ensuring that the work under the contract is being completed according to the statement of work, according to the scope of the contract. And that is very important because that's how project success is measured. But it's equally important to ensure overall contract compliance. Because the contract is a legal binding document, it's important that both parties, the buyer and the seller, adhere to all terms and conditions of the contract. I'd like to relate to you a personal experience I had where I didn't manage the terms and conditions of the contract properly and had a contract canceled on me. I was delivering a project under contract and was meeting all of the statements of work according to all contact with the buying authority. Everything on the project was going well. They were happy with the work. The work was being completed on time. We were absolutely satisfying the terms and conditions of the statement of work. But without warning, we got notice from the buyer that they wished to terminate the contract with cause. And with cause means that we have violated the terms and conditions of the contract, and they were able to walk away from the contract with no penalties and no fees. How could they get away with terminating the contract with clause? Where in fact we were adhering to the statement of work and everything, the scope, the deliverables, everything was according to specification? They found another clause in the contract that we were in violation of. And it was a very simple contract clause that basically stated the seller, that was me, was responsible for delivering a detailed status report to the buyer by every Tuesday at noon. Well, through personal relationship, we had changed that, and I was no longer delivering weekly status reports by Tuesday at noon. I was delivering biweekly status reports every Friday. But because the customer suddenly wanted to terminate the contract, they found this clause in the legalese in the contract that said we're in violation, and therefore they had rights to terminate with cause. Why did they want to terminate with cause? A, they wanted to terminate with cause because they could terminate with no penalties, no recourse. But B, they wanted to terminate with cause because the business condition had changed. The company wanted to cancel the project. The company no longer needed the project results because the business environment had changed, and therefore they went looking for reasons to terminate with cause. And by something as simple as not adhering to a term and condition in the legal part of the contract, they were able to terminate with clause, and my company had to walk away from the contract partially completed with substantial work outstanding, substantial bills outstanding, simply because status reports were not produced according to a schedule, and I had not executed the proper change management to ensure that the contract was being completed according to details in the contract. So whether you're a buyer or a seller, be aware of all of the terms and conditions in the contract, both the statement of work and the legal aspects of the contract, and ensure that you're in total compliance with the contract. Another key aspect to contract administration is payments, the making and receipt of payments. The status of the payments, the state of payments, the terms and conditions of payments will all be contained in the contract. And again, it's important for both parties to adhere to those terms and conditions to ensure that both parties are happy with the fiscal relationship as part of the contract. And finally, as alluded to already, you need to have change management in place with the contract, because the contract is a legal binding document. Any deviations to the contract, any deviations such as changing the status report, any deviations to the statement of work, any deviation to the acceptance criteria, any deviation to any aspect of that signed contract must be documented through formal change management, and both parties with the appropriate signing authority sign off on the change management, which then becomes a legal binding amendment to the original contract. So back to the scenario that I described earlier, had I executed change management, and had I executed the change that says status reports will no longer be weekly at noon, status reports will be biweekly Fridays, there would have been no cause for termination with cause, and if the customer had wanted to terminate the contract, there would have been penalties for early termination. All payments, all outstanding invoices would have been paid, and my company would have been far better off. So be very aware of the implications of appropriate contract management and ensure that you're managing to the exact terms and conditions of the contract to protect yourself and your company, whether you are a buyer or whether you are a seller. Contract closure is a relatively straightforward process that needs to be followed on your project at the completion of each contract, at the completion of each procurement component. You don't do contract closure once at the end of the project. You do contract closure as many times as you need to for as many individual procurements that are active on your project. Contract closure consists of final acceptance. The final acceptance of the final deliverables that all terms and conditions, that the complete scope, the complete statement of work have been satisfied. In reality, signing the final acceptance document relieves the buyer and the seller of any contract obligations and certifies that the contract is closed. Consistent with that will be the release of any final payments, any final invoices, and the appropriate processes put in place to make any payments based on holdbacks or any warranty claims or any warranty processes that are related with the contract itself. Often forgotten but a critical component for contract closure is the return of any property between the buyer and the seller. It could be intellectual property or it could be physical property that has been shared between the buyer and the seller. It's important during contract closure that all property, both intellectual and physical property, is returned to the proper owner, whether the buyer or the seller. And finally, an often overlooked but very important aspect for project closure, contract closure rather, is to gather and harvest lessons learned. Simply stated, lessons learned. Would we do business with this supplier, with this seller again? Was this procurement process a good experience or was this a bad experience?